Welcome, welcome, Elaine. I mean, it's absolutely fabulous to have you here. You and I had
Mhm.
just had a little bit of a 5 minutes connection, and um, it was really fabulous to actually see you in person and give you a hug
Mm,
on
yeah,
Monday in
yeah.
London, which is what makes this even extra special. As I think I was saying to you, this project of mine of Audacious Conversations was set up beginning of this year to
Mhm,
really have courageous, audacious, caring conversations with inspiring people. You know,
mm,
people that I love, and which makes it extra special that I got to connect with you before we actually had this virtual, live conversation. And I have got your book with me. So for everybody who's joining us, Elaine has learned what says is written the Unlearning Silence, How to Speak Your Mind, Unleash Talent, and Lead with Courage. I'm doing it this way, which came out on the 21st of March, I believe. So it's now out there into the world. And having read it now, having had the chance to do it, I'd love to explore some
mhm,
of those lanes because I was saying to you, my book is coming out in August, and it's got the audacity spectrum. It's also got courage and care, and
mhm,
so there is overlap and also differences. So it'd
mhm.
be great to explore some of that. But before, do you want to introduce yourselves to I was going to say our readers, but definitely a lot of
Sure,
readers.
sure.
For our
Uh,
listeners.
yeah, I'm Elaine Lin Hering. There is a list of different credentials that I could share, right? I went to Harvard Law School, taught at Harvard Law School, have worked on 6 continents, been in leadership development for quite a while. But the place I most like to start in introductions is that I am human.
Hmm.
And the reason I start there is because it still surprises me that we each forget that we are human. We look at the titles that we hold, the experiences that we have, the roles that we play, and we make incredible assumptions about who people are, whether we can interact with them, how they might show up. And there's often such a disconnect between how people see ourselves and how we see ourselves.
Hmm.
So someone the other day said, "Oh my gosh, you're the Elaine Lin Hering." And I was like, I don't even know what that means. I am trying to figure out carpool school pickup for my kid and, reply to the client proposal requirements as well. So the disconnect between how we see ourselves and how other people see us, I think certainly has implications for care and courage and conformity or non-conformity as well. So, hi, I'm Elaine Lin Hering, author of Unlearning Silence and fellow human being.
Oh, fabulous. Well, it's a real privilege and pleasure
Mm,
and to have you here, Elaine.
likewise.
And thank you. Thank you for being here with us.
Thanks for having me.
Silence. Actually, it's
Mm,
interesting for you because you've got the book has got those two pieces of awareness and action.
mhm,
So I'm watching myself as I'm an action person. So I would want to go straight into action, but I'm
yeah.
I'm stopping myself. The awareness and the silence part of it is really really important. And your
Mhm,
definition of silence is fascinating.
mm.
So what is silence for you?
Yeah. The silence we often think about, I would argue, is a good one, meaning we need more meditative silence in this busy world. How transformative would our meetings be if we all took a moment of silence before we started rather than coming straight from the last meeting and still sort of mentally being somewhere else? I'd argue that we also need more silence, more space between stimulus and response, and we would all benefit from choosing our responses rather than being reactive. And the silence I'm talking about that I want us to collectively unlearn is when there's not enough room in the conversation or in the relationship or on the team for you, for your thoughts, your feelings, your needs. When you edit out parts of yourself, your thoughts, your identities, because that seems the only way to keep your seat at the table.
Hmm.
It is also when you, as a well intentioned leader, say, "All right, team, tell me what you really think," right? I'm here. I am here to support you. And no one says anything back. And having worked with both leaders and team members, that is such a frustrating dynamic, right? Leaders are saying, I am open, I am here, I know that I need your perspective. And yet, the positions we hold, how we show up, despite our good intentions, often unintentionally silence the very people we lead, the very people we want to support. And so, unlearning silence is, how is that showing up? In what ways might we have learned silence?
Mm.
I'd argue that many of us have been rewarded for staying silent, right? Don't rock the boat, keep the peace. You'll get that promotion if you toe the party line. But we also miss out on the incredible opportunity for innovation and real collaboration and addressing issues before they get too big. And that's not even talking about honoring human dignity. But that's the silence I'm talking about, that before we get to action, having an honest awareness and intellectual honesty around, how does silence show up on our teams, in our own habits, our unconscious, subconscious habits, because we've learned it over time, and how is silence baked into the policies and practices that form the systems we're all part of. To start from the premise that we're all starting from an even playing ground and things impact us the same way is to start from a false premise.
Mm.
So I'm with you of, I am also action oriented. And so there's that moment in the book where I say, I'm action oriented too. Hang on, because action without cognitive understanding is less likely to stick. So I'm glad that we're dwelling for a minute on awareness.
Lovely. No, absolutely. And in a way, I love that for you, that this image of space and
Mm,
not having enough space. It's very powerful and very potent. And, the edited version of
mhm,
ourselves, what
mhm,
we choose to edit out, what we
mm,
choose to edit in. And one of the things that really resonated with me was your concept of a calculation. We
mhm.
sort of, what is the cost? How do we calculate
Yeah,
before we even take the action? As you said,
yeah,
inaction is also. So I would love to go a little bit deeper and
yeah,
get you to explain that concept more.
yeah, absolutely. So often when it comes to speaking up or being heard, the advice is just do it.
Mm,
Sort of a Nike standard. And if you are not effective in being heard, in getting your needs met, then the frame around that is, you're flawed. You need to
mm,
have more courage. You need to have more confidence. Go fix yourself. And it's true, there is a responsibility for each of us to unlearn the ways that we silence ourselves. But that courage, that confidence is necessary but not sufficient. To me, it really comes down to calculation. And it is an unconscious, subconscious calculation that we do in a split second of, is it safe? Is it worth it for me to disclose my identity, to share my thought? There are three questions that we tend to ask, and this is chapter 3 of the book, which
mhm,
is my favorite one, titled When Silence Makes Sense. Because I want to be really clear for listeners that unlearning silence does not mean saying everything all the time to everyone. The world is too noisy and complex for that. But it does go down to what you identified as, when we choose.
mhm,
Do we get to choose? Do I have the agency to choose? And part of what goes into my choosing is the calculation. We're often asking, what are the costs of speaking up? And there are real costs, the short term ones of, my palms are getting sweaty. I don't have time for this right now. How are they going to react?
mm,
Am I having to deal with their defensiveness, if there is defensiveness or retaliation or blowback? Right? What are the costs of speaking up? Then there's also the question that we analyze subconsciously: what are the benefits of staying silent?
mhm,
And in a classic cost benefit analysis, there are benefits to staying silent, right? Staying silent means I could trade in the gray. I can let you make assumptions about me and what I believe. And maybe that's fine if it's on an issue that I don't care too much
mhm,
about.
mhm,
If I go over to my in-laws for dinner and my in-laws make something I don't particularly like, I might stay silent when they ask me, "How is it?" and just smile and say, or, "It's delicious.
Mhm.
It's fine." That is my agency to decide I'm not really going to get into it with you right now because I see you once a year and it's just not worth it for me to
Mhm.
say, "Actually, not my favorite," right? You don't need to know that about me, or at least that's what I am choosing to say. So what are the costs of speaking up? What are the benefits of staying silent? And then the third is, in light of those things, what makes sense for me? But what makes sense for me also fails to acknowledge, missing in that analysis is, what are the benefits of speaking up and what are the costs of staying silent?
Mhm.
Someone once said to me that anything worth discussing in life can fit into a 2 by 2 grid, an XY axis. And I really struggled with that because, as a matter of nonconformity, I think not everybody thinks in 2 by 2s.
Mhm.
But in missing in our calculation is some of the biases that we face. So I also warn against those. One is the present bias. We
Mhm.
focus on the short term costs and potential short term benefits rather than thinking about the long term costs and
Mhm.
long term benefits. We also tend to focus on ourselves, which makes sense, right? As a matter of survival, I
Mhm.
am going to incur the costs most poignantly, but we are all interconnected. So, when we're talking about culture of voice or culture on the team, what I do and say impacts what you end up doing and saying, the norms we co create. So, my silence isn't just about me, your silence isn't just about you, but about the world we are actually co creating. And in that moment, our lizard brains forget that. Our lizard brains aren't thinking about, oh, what culture are we co creating? It's just, I do not want to deal with you. I stay silent. So to me, that awareness, even before we get to action, is, what is my calculation? How accurate is it? How fear based is it?
Mhm.
And is it the calculation that leads me to the aspirational self I want to be?
Mhm.
Or the just a reflection of the habits that I've adopted and formed over time?
Mhm. Thank you.
Mm,
And what came to mind, actually, and as you're saying, is absolutely in that choice, that agency that you're talking about. So, in my book, I have a chapter called assertiveness. So I have the 8 ways of becoming more audacious, which is more courageous and caring
mhm,
and non-conforming. And that is the art of no. And I also talk about the silent no, which
yes.
is sort of avoiding.
Mhm,
And for me, it's interesting you're saying courage is not enough.
mhm,
And I sometimes resist that, I debate that, because that's what I teach people, it's the courage. And yet, of course, you've got
mhm,
to take into calculation, as you said,
mhm,
cost and benefits of each person in that circle.
mhm,
And yes, there is a benefit to staying silent, there is no doubt about it. when
mm,
when the outcome is not important,
yeah.
the relationship is not important, we're wasting a lot of energy
Yes.
by actually just going into action, or saying something. So um, absolutely. And one of the other thing I wanted to, before we move into action, which I'm still, I can't wait to move into action, but I'm stopping myself, that pause, as you said, between um, you know I suppose the reaction and the response, but is, I heard you talking about conformity as
Mm,
loyalty, which intrigued me.
mhm,
When people conform, they do it out of loyalty. They conform
mm.
to the rules of the corporation or whatever they chose. So tell me more.
Yeah, and let's be clear that, to me, well, who are you being loyal to if you
Mhm,
conform?
mhm,
I'd argue that you're being loyal to someone else,
mhm,
which does not mean you're being loyal to yourself,
mhm,
which may beg the question, who am I? Right? If you have silenced your needs for a long time, you may be lacking a sense of self.
mhm.
And so loyalty is held up so often as such a good thing.
Yes.
I'd start by interrogating, who are you loyal? Who are you being loyal to?
Mm,
And of course, loyalty in a work team, in a family is rewarded. You maintain the social connection, you maintain the affiliation. Your loyalty may be a prerequisite for you keeping your job or staying in that
mm,
relationship.
mm.
And this is where the interrogation comes in, which is, do I even want to stay in this relationship? Do I even want to stay in the job if what is required of me to stay here
Mm,
is conformity? And by conformity, I mean having to silence parts of yourself, having to silence your needs, having to edit out parts of yourself, not having your own needs met.
mm,
That non-conformity has such positives. But I'd argue that gravity really wants to shove us into conformity, not just from a loyalty perspective, but all the research around mimicry
mhm,
that people are more likely to want to work with, say yes to, want to spend time with people who look and sound like them. So we try to conform as much as we can. And there are parts of us that really, if I am female in a male dominant environment, there's only so much conforming I can do.
mhm,
I am still going to stick out. And the challenge of trying to conform to a dominant norm is that the dominant norm still gets to decide what is right, good, and appropriate. And
mm,
so often, those of us who carry subordinated identities in that context based on race, gender, ability, class, etc., we find ourselves playing to those rules, trying to conform only for the goalpost to be moved.
mm,
And it takes us back to this first question of loyalty to whom?
mhm,
Loyalty to the group, loyalty to the dominant norm, or loyalty to self. If everything else around us is likely to change, which the last couple of years of the world has shown us just that, and the people who define the goalpost may also change, then for me, the safer long-term bet is to live in alignment with the values I hold and how I want to show up, loyalty to self rather than to other.
mm. Beautiful. Thank you. And actually, it is interesting for me. I always say that what takes more courage than saying yes, it's saying no.
Mhm,
And
mhm,
therefore, the no to conformity to others.
mhm,
It really takes a lot of that
mhm.
courage, the internal strength.
Yes, and where this is where I think courage and calculation actually play well together. If we knew that others would still accept us,
Hmm.
still respect us, still hear us, still be married to us, still be our colleagues, even if we said no, how much less courage it would require because the calculation would change. And that to me is why unlearning silence is how can we also unlearn the ways we silence each other?
Mm,
Because I have the power to make your life easier, less scary, fill in the blank, more fulfilling by being able to hear you, even if you think differently, act differently than I do. So that's a strong yes and
mm,
for courage. And what can we each do for each other to change the calculation?
mm. Love that. And actually, what came to mind, Elaine, I had is this concept of yours of silencing others,
Mm,
which really did not. I don't want to use the word trigger. In the moment, I couldn't think of anything else. But there was I have got a recent client who came with this sort of case study,
yeah.
effectively, and I think you do. When I was looking at the book, I'm trying to remember which of the. I think it was chapter 7,
Mm,
using voice, and you use the example of Layla. And when I
mm,
read that, I thought, oh, that's like deja vu. This is,
mm,
my client saying she's in a meeting, whether it is in person, where it is
yeah.
online, and then she's trying to ask a question or make a statement, and then
Yep.
someone talks over, that types of
Yep.
interruption. So I'm curious, what would be well, I suppose your advice, if I could even call it that way, but if someone had that dilemma,
Mhm,
what to do?
mhm. Yeah, I love that you raised this. I feel apologetic for triggering, and I've tried to write with as much clarity and compassion as possible, right? I don't think any of us intend to silence people, which is the
Mm,
fundamental dilemma. Right? Why do so many people feel silenced by each other? And at home, it's, unloved, unseen, unheard when we are so well intentioned and so want to show up. How
mm,
can we close that gap?
mm,
And that our choices can either incline people towards sharing with us or not sharing with us. That to me is the how do we silence each other? And I know I do it. We as humans do it. It's not a right or wrong, it's a human
mm,
challenge. But if I were Layla, if I were an individual trying to get a word in and I repeatedly get interrupted by my colleagues, I mean, this is a fact pattern that far too many of us have experienced.
mm,
This idea of, well, you just need to have more courage in that moment feels wholly insufficient. And so in chapter 7, I explore different levers for voice,
mhm,
meaning when we talk about speaking up, being heard, we're often focused on the substance. The what are we talking about? The terms and conditions, the budget, the norms. We forget that speaking up is also how do people feel?
mhm,
Who's in the room? How much do you trust me? So am I tending to the relationship? And the third lever for voice is actually process, which is the least sexy of them, sort of the underrated stepchild, but has a profound impact on outcomes, right?
mhm,
Both on how people feel treated and what we end up doing. If substance is the what, relationship is the who, process is the how.
mhm,
The example in the book is, we've got all these people on the same video call, 30 people on a video call. Some people are video cameras on, some people off. There's dogs barking, there's people in office, all of this. How are you supposed to be heard there? The setup is suboptimal. So it's actually not a you problem, it's a how we're working together problem. So the or opportunity.
mhm,
And so the question to me would be, how can we redesign the way that we're communicating?
mm,
What is the purpose of this meeting? What is the overall objective of the work together? And also, how do people on this team best communicate?
mm,
Because we don't all communicate best by video chat. That's just the reality of our wiring. Can communicating asynchronously or by typing, how do we integrate that into our design? Because if we're not tending to or paying attention to actively designing how we work together, we tend to just replicate what we've seen. And what we've seen typically benefits the people who hold the most organizational or institutional power,
mm,
right? We meet in the time zone that is optimal for the CEO or the board. And if I am an engineer in another part of the world and you're asking me to be at that meeting at 2 a.m. my time, that to me is an instance of when we unintentionally incline people towards silence.
yes.
There's no blame in that. There's no perfect time zone. I've tried to find it. But can we be intellectually honest about if you're asking someone to be on a call at that hour in their local time, it doesn't matter if we call it time shifting or something other fancy lingo around it. It seems unrealistic to
Mm,
expect them to be firing on all cylinders. So my advice in that instance would be take a good look at the process of what you're actually trying to achieve, design accordingly, including where you can playing to your strengths.
mhm,
Are you a real-time processor? Or are you a post processor where actually after the meeting, 20 minutes after the meeting is like, oh, that's what I
mm,
would have said? Then design the process accordingly so that decision making is at the end of the meeting, this is where we're circling to, this is where we think we're going to land. Everyone go home, sleep on it. And as you post process, using that language to normalize
mhm, mhm,
behavior,
mhm,
put it in this Slack channel so that everyone knows what the avenues are. It takes out the calculation that energy that goes towards, should I say something? Should I not say something? Is it too late? Did I miss my thought? Should I call them? Should I email them? Right? We're making the avenues clear.
Mm.
And it's a huge under-leveraged opportunity that impacts the outcomes and how people feel and who gets to succeed.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I love that. The process being the less sexy part of it, and yet
Really.
it's really very, very important. And it takes intentionality,
Mhm.
because
Mhm.
it is in all the sort of the global corporation, is the person who's there at 2 o'clock, there has to be some acknowledgement. Well, in my view, that's where the
Yeah.
caring part comes into play.
Yeah.
They've obviously went that extra mile, and
Mhm.
being really attentive to the process, so it doesn't always happen,
Yes.
in the same conformed way, that's one person is being singled out, or a minority.
Mhm. Mhm. Also asking the question, the way that we're doing things, does this actually work? How
Mm,
many of us have inherited habits and teams, and we have this call? Everyone knows it's it has no, everyone wants to be there. We don't
yeah.
actually know what we're doing, but we go through the motions because it's always been done.
Yes.
Can we examine it in the name of efficiency or productivity or whatever resonates in your culture to say, huh, is this working for us? How could we make it better? If it's not working for us, what might we change?
Mm,
And so often in those instances, people worry about the judgment. How will the person who set it up feel? Are we honoring their legacy? Again, we go back to your point about nonconformity and loyalty. Who are you being loyal to? Are you being loyal to the person who was the manager three iterations of the team, three reorgs before? Or are you being loyal to the cause and what you're building going forward together?
mm. Absolutely. And I'm aware of time. I think, we've got sort of 3 minutes. I wanted to share something that I found hugely fascinating, actually, when I in the research that you did for the book. So I wanted to read it out. But
Mhm.
in a way, and you and I were talking about children and family just before we started. But um, you've got these stats that on average, children ask around 125 questions a day, and adults ask around 6. And oh wow, when I just looked at those stats, obviously,
Mhm.
the curiosity that just us as children, and then how we lose that as we
Mhm.
go to adulthood. Uh,
Mhm.
but you also have this other particular one in. So you had Silence on the Big Screen, which again, it really surprised me. You did a study for 1,300 popular films made between '07 and 19, which revealed only 30% of the speaking characters were female. And so for every one female speaking, there were 2.2 males speaking. And in addition, hardly any were non-white.
Mhm.
Wow.
Mhm.
It's just mind blowing, to know.
It is, and I went back and I was like, "That can't be true."
Mm,
It's 2023, it's 2020, it can't be true, and then I thought about the films, and it was true, and that is why we start with awareness, because
yes.
if we're unaware of what we're ingesting, just by walking down the street, looking at billboards, watching, it's just a film, and it's not even it's a fiction film. Why would it influence us? Because the people who get to speak, their voices become normed. We get used to people with disabilities don't speak if that's what we see on the big screen, which is why, I really struggled with the phrase representation matters. That felt like, ugh, really? It's not a big deal. Why name it? And when you look at those statistics, it really does change our perception over
Mm,
time, and based on where we live or what industry we're in, we may not see such representation or such diversity of different identities. So how much more important does it become that the media we consume does reflect a broader swath of
mm,
humanity, including, not for representation's sake, but to remember almost where we started this conversation,
mm.
that we each are human, even if we look and sound different than one another. So then how do we honor our humanity?
Yes, despite our differences. And actually, well, I mean, we're celebrating difference this year, as you and I were talking. So my son being on the spectrum, April is a favorite month of mine. It is the autism month. But I'm aware that we sort of, at a time, I wanted to,
Mm,
well, where do people find you if they
mm.
wanted to reach out to you, Elaine?
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn, Elaine Lin Hering, or my website, elainelinhering.com. Both have ways to join a free newsletter monthly about using your voice and creating space for those differences of voice.
Fabulous. Well, thank you so much. I would love to continue the conversation, and I will, well, not challenge, but I would love to continue it,
Mhm.
one way or another. Whether we'll do it another way, but offline and online.
Perfect.
And absolutely, it's definitely a great book for anybody who's watching us to go and grab it and read it and become use their voice. I think
Mhm.
that's the
Mm.
invitation. As someone who loves to use the voice, I'm making that big invitation to everybody out there. So thank you from my
Thank
heart to
you.
yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Alina.